The first time I left food at the clearing, I told myself it was for the black bears. That's what you're supposed to do when you're a wildlife rehabilitator living at the edge of Olympic National Forest. You document, you observe, you maintain professional distance, you don't feed wild animals, you especially don't feed animals that aren't supposed to exist. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived in the same cabin on the Keno River boundary for 37 years. I've treated injured owls, rehabilitated orphaned fawns, and once spent 6 weeks nursing a cougar kitten back to health after its mother was killed by a logging truck. I thought I understood the forest. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. Then came the winter of 2018, and the knocking. It started in late November. 3 sharp raps on the outer wall of my supply shed, always around 2 a.m. Always the same rhythm. Not random, not wind or falling branches. Deliberate, purposeful, the kind of sound that makes you sit up in bed and wonder if you should be afraid or curious. I chose curious. The morning after the first knocking, I found tracks in the frost outside the shed, 18 inches long, 5 toes, bipedal stride. I'd seen these prints before over the years. Everyone who lives this deep in the forest has seen them, but I'd always filed them away under things we don't talk about and moved on with my day. But these prints were fresh, and they were accompanied by something I hadn't seen before. Smaller prints beside them, maybe 12 inches long, child-sized stride, following the larger ones in a pattern that spoke of dependence and learning, a parent and offspring, a mother and child. The shed door had been tested, not forced but examined. The latch had finger marks in the frost, as if someone had tried to understand how it worked without actually breaking in. Inside, nothing was disturbed except for a 50-pound bag of dried corn I keep for the deer. It had been moved carefully and a small amount was missing from the top. I stood there in the cold morning light looking at those impossible prints and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to help them, not study them, not document them for science or fame or validation, just help them survive a winter that was already showing signs of being brutal. I had no idea that simple act of compassion would bring the full weight of federal authority down on this quiet corner of the forest. The protocol I developed was simple. Leave food in a specific location, always at dusk, always the same amount. No cameras, no observation equipment, no attempt to witness the exchange. I would provide, they would take, and the forest would keep its secrets. I started with basics: dried corn, root vegetables, smoked fish from my own smokehouse, things that would provide calories and nutrition through the lean winter months. I left them in a wooden crate at the edge of the clearing about 200 yards from my cabin, visible from my porch but far enough to maintain distance. The first offering disappeared within hours. The second night, I added variety: apples from my cold storage, dried venison, a container of honey. By morning, everything was gone except the container, which had been carefully opened, the honey consumed, and the container placed back in the crate with the lid screwed on tight. That detail stopped me cold. The manual dexterity required to unscrew a lid, the understanding of containers and their purpose, the courtesy of returning it rather than carrying it off or discarding it. These weren't animal behaviors. These were the actions of someone with intelligence, tool use, and what I could only describe as etiquette. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. I would leave food at dusk. By dawn, it would be gone, and occasionally there would be something left in return. Bundles of cedar bark stripped cleanly from trees, useful for kindling. Smooth river stones arranged in neat stacks. Once, a deer antler shed, placed carefully in the center of the crate. Gifts, or trade, or perhaps simply acknowledgement that this exchange was mutual, that taking without giving violated some code I didn't fully understand. I began keeping a journal, not for publication but for comprehension. December 8th. Left 2 whole salmon, gone by morning. Found 3 perfect arrowheads made from obsidian in the crate. Not ancient artifacts, but fresh work. Someone is napping stone tools. December 15th. Heavy snow last night. Doubled the food portions. This morning, the path from my cabin to the clearing had been cleared. Branches moved aside, snow packed down. They're making it easier for me to reach the feeding site. The relationship, because that's what it was becoming, deepened with the cold. On December 21st, the winter solstice, I left a special offering: roasted chicken, fresh bread, dried fruits, and a thermos of hot soup. I know soup in a thermos seems absurd, but something about the brutality of that particular night, temperature below zero, wind howling down from the peaks, made me want to offer warmth, not just calories. The next morning, the thermos was returned empty and clean, placed in the crate with a bundle of plants I recognized as medicinal: yarrow, Oregon grapefruit, and devil's club bark. Each one had specific healing properties. Each one was harvested correctly, at the right time, in the right way. They were sharing their knowledge with me, the way I was sharing my food with them. By January, I'd calculated I was going through roughly 100 pounds of food per week. My savings took a hit, but my garden surplus and hunting skills covered most of it. I stopped going into town except when absolutely necessary. The fewer people who saw me buying bulk supplies, the fewer questions would be asked. My neighbors, the few who lived within 10 miles, noticed my increased isolation. Martha Hendricks, who ran the general store in Quinault, asked if I was okay, if maybe the solitude was getting to me. I told her I was working on a project documenting winter wildlife patterns. She looked at me with the kind of knowing skepticism that comes from living in the Pacific Northwest your whole life. "You be careful out there, Tom," she said. "Woods are deeper than they look this time of year. People see things that make them question what's real." I just nodded and carried my supplies to the truck. The first direct sighting came on January 19th. I'd made a mistake. Left the food later than usual because I'd been treating an injured hawk that had come down my chimney. It was already dark when I carried the crate to the clearing, just the beam of my headlamp cutting through the snow. I was 50 yards from the feeding site when I saw them. Two figures standing at the tree line, absolutely still. The larger one was massive, 7.5 feet tall at least, broad through the shoulders, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that looked almost copper in my headlamp beam. The smaller one, maybe 4 feet tall, pressed close to the larger one's side, one hand gripping what appeared to be the adult's arm. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 seconds. My headlamp illuminated them clearly enough to see details: the intelligent eyes that caught and reflected light, the human-like hands, the postural communication between parent and child that transcended species, protection, reassurance, trust. Then the larger one made a sound, low, rumbling, not aggressive but communicative. The small one responded with a higher-pitched vocalization, and they stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for beings that size. I left the food crate and walked back to my cabin with my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the clearing, trying to process what I'd witnessed. They were real. They were here, and I'd been feeding them for nearly 2 months. By morning, the crate was empty, and there was a new gift: a woven basket made from cedar bark, so expertly crafted it could have been sold in any art gallery in Seattle. Inside the basket were winter berries, kinnikinick and salal, carefully preserved, enough to last me weeks. The message was clear. This relationship was working for both of us. They needed my help to survive the winter, and I needed their presence to remember that the world still held room for wonder, for mystery, for things that shouldn't be possible but undeniably were. I just had no idea how fragile that mutual trust would turn out to be. February brought a thaw, then a freeze, then snow so heavy the forest transformed into a cathedral of white silence. The feeding schedule became sacred. Every evening at dusk, without fail, regardless of weather, I expanded the offerings based on what seemed to work: high-protein foods, root vegetables that would store energy, medicinal plants when I noticed the tracks showing irregularities that suggested injury or illness. The small one, the juvenile, was growing. I could see it in the track sizes, the stride length, the increasing independence shown in the patterns around the clearing. Sometimes the tracks would show the young one exploring alone, venturing 30 or 40 yards from where the mother waited, then returning. Childhood curiosity, parental supervision, universal behaviors expressed in impossible bodies. I started noticing other things too: trees marked with deliberate scratches at specific heights, territory markers, I assumed, or communication signs for others of their kind. Structures made from woven branches almost like small shelters, positioned in strategic locations around my property boundary. They were mapping the area, understanding it, making it their own, and they were teaching the juvenile about me. On February 11th, I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when I heard a sound that made me freeze. A low whistle, almost musical, coming from the tree line. I turned slowly and saw the small one, partially visible behind a massive Douglas fir, watching me work. The mother was there too, further back, observing her child observing me. The juvenile whistled again, 2 notes, rising pitch, then ducked back behind the tree. I could hear what sounded like soft vocalizations between them, instructions or reassurance. Then the small one peeked out again, curious, testing boundaries. I did the only thing that felt right. I waved. Just a simple hand gesture, acknowledging presence without threat. The juvenile startled back behind the tree. More vocalizations from the mother. Then, slowly, a small hand emerged from behind the trunk, fingers splayed, palm forward, mimicking my gesture. They were teaching their child that I was safe, that this human, unlike others their species had learned to fear, could be trusted. I went back to splitting wood, moving slowly, predictably, letting them watch and learn that my routines were harmless. After 20 minutes, they withdrew back into the forest, but something fundamental had shifted. We'd acknowledged each other. We'd communicated across the species barrier in a way that suggested mutual understanding. That night, I found a carved stick in the food crate, smoothed and shaped, clearly worked by intelligent hands, with simple geometric patterns burned into the wood. It was beautiful. It was art. I kept it on my mantle, proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that this was really happening. But others were starting to notice too. In mid-February, a Forest Service ranger named Webb came by my property, ostensibly checking on winter access roads. He was young, maybe 30, with that earnest competence of someone who took their job seriously. "Getting much wildlife activity out here this winter?" he asked, casual but probing. "The usual. Some deer, a few elk. Couple of black bears that haven't fully hibernated." He nodded, looking past me toward the clearing. "We've had some reports. Hikers seeing tracks that don't match known species. Trail cameras picking up anomalies. You seen anything unusual?" "Unusual how?" "Large bipedal prints. Vocalizations that don't match our catalogs. You know." He met my eyes directly. "The kind of thing that gets people excited and makes our job complicated." I kept my expression neutral. "Can't say I have, but I'm pretty isolated out here. Don't get much beyond my property line these days." Webb handed me his card. "You see anything worth reporting? You let me know. There's been increased interest in this area. Government types, research permits being filed. Better to get ahead of it than have strangers poking around uninvited." After he left, I stood on my porch for a long time, watching the forest, feeling the weight of his warning. Someone knew. Someone was paying attention. The question was, how much did they know? And how long did I have before this private arrangement became a public incident? I decided to increase the food drops, build up their reserves in case I had to stop abruptly. I also started varying the timing, making the pattern less predictable, hoping that inconsistency might provide some protection if observers were tracking the exchanges. But the family group had their own response to the increased surveillance. On February 23rd, I found my trail camera, the one I used for documenting deer populations, disabled. Not smashed or stolen, but carefully dismantled. The battery removed, the memory card taken out, and all of it placed in a neat pile at the base of the camera pole. The message was clear. No documentation, no evidence. Trust required privacy. I respected that. I took down my other 2 cameras and stored them in the shed. The gifts in the food crate became more frequent and more specific. Medicinal plants I'd mentioned needing in my journal, which I kept in the cabin. Had they somehow seen it through the window? Tools made from antler and stone, perfectly balanced for specific tasks. Once, a beautiful necklace made from bear claws and river stones, strung on sinew with expert knotting. I wore that necklace when I made the evening food deliveries. It felt like acceptance, like being adopted into something larger than myself. March brought the first signs of spring, early wildflowers, returning songbirds, the sense that winter's hardest edge was dulling. The food requirements decreased slightly as natural forage became more available. The tracks around the clearing showed the juvenile growing more confident, ranging farther, learning to find food independently. They were going to survive. We'd made it through the winter together. That's when the helicopters came. 2 of them, black and unmarked, circling low over the forest on March 15th. They made multiple passes over my property, over the clearing, over the areas where I'd seen the most activity. The sound sent every animal within miles into panicked silence. I stood on my porch and watched them, and I knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change. That night, the family group didn't come to the clearing. For the first time in 4 months, the food I left sat untouched until morning. They knew. Whatever those helicopters represented, they knew it meant danger, and they were right. The official vehicles arrived 3 days later. 2 Park Service trucks, 1 unmarked SUV with federal plates, and a mobile command unit that they set up in the clearing I'd been using as a feeding site. I watched from my porch as 8 people in various uniforms and tactical gear established what looked like a research station exactly where I'd been leaving food for months. I gave them 30 minutes before walking down to confront whatever was happening. The man in charge introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Reed, Department of the Interior, Wildlife Protection Division. He was 50s, gray at the temples with the kind of authority that comes from decades of dealing with situations most people never know exist. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for your cooperation. I haven't cooperated with anything yet. This is my property line you're setting up on. Actually, this is federal land. Your property ends 50 yards north of here. We have permits for emergency wildlife research and protection operations. He gestured to the equipment being unloaded. We're aware you've been conducting unauthorized feeding of protected species. That's a federal violation, but right now that's not our primary concern. Protected species. They knew exactly what I'd been feeding. How long have you been watching? I asked. Long enough to know that you've made contact with a breeding pair and juvenile of an undocumented species that falls under the most restricted protection protocols in federal wildlife law. Long enough to know that your feeding pattern has altered their behavior in ways that could prove catastrophic, if not managed carefully. A woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to her ID badge. She had the look of someone who spent more time in labs than forests. Mr. Whitmore, we're not here to arrest you. We're here because the situation has become critical. The family group you've been feeding has been documented approaching within visual range of a logging operation 8 miles from here. They've been observed by at least 3 civilians who have cell phone footage. We're approximately 72 hours from this becoming a public incident. The weight of that settled in my chest like a stone. I'd made them comfortable with humans. I'd taught them that people meant food and safety. And that conditioning had nearly walked them straight into exposure, capture, or worse. What do you want from me? I asked. Dr. Reed pulled out a tablet and showed me thermal footage. The same clearing I was standing in, filmed from above, showing 2 large heat signatures and 1 smaller one approaching the food crate. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. We want you to help us establish safe boundaries. The feeding needs to stop immediately, but it needs to stop in a way that doesn't cause panic or make them seek out alternative human contact. You've built trust with them. We need you to use that trust to teach them to avoid us again. You want me to betray them. We want you to save them, Dr. Chen said quietly. Right now, they associate humans with food and safety. That's a death sentence for a species that survived by avoiding us completely. Every day you've fed them, you've unintentionally eroded millions of years of adaptive behavior. We need to restore that distance, or they won't survive the next encounter with humans who aren't as compassionate as you. She was right. And I hated that she was right. Dr. Reed continued, we're establishing a permanent exclusion zone. This entire area, approximately 40 square miles, will be designated critical habitat with no public access. But the family group doesn't know boundaries on a map. They know patterns and learned behavior. You need to help us teach them that this area is safe, but human contact outside of it is dangerous. How? Gradually reduce the feeding. Make the schedule unpredictable. Eventually stop completely. When they come looking, we'll have deterrents in place. Not harmful but uncomfortable. Sounds that encourage retreat. Barriers that suggest this territory is no longer accessible. Over time, they'll revert to natural foraging and return to their original avoidance patterns. It made sense strategically, but the thought of deliberately disappointing them, of breaking the trust I'd spent months building, felt like a betrayal deeper than any federal violation. What happens if I refuse? Dr. Reed's expression hardened. Then we do it without you. Less gently, less carefully. And you face federal charges for interfering with protected species management. Your choice, Mr. Whitmore. I looked past them toward the forest where I knew the family was hiding, probably watching this entire exchange, trying to understand why their safe place had suddenly filled with strangers and equipment and threat. I'll do it, I said. But on one condition: no capture attempts, no tagging, no invasive research. This is about protection, not study. Dr. Chen and Dr. Reed exchanged glances. Finally, Dr. Reed nodded. Agreed. This species falls under the same protocols as uncontacted human populations. Observation only, from maximum distance, with priority given to their autonomy and territorial integrity. That night, I left food in the clearing one more time, but I also left a note. knowing they couldn't read it but needing to say it anyway. I'm sorry. They found out. It's not safe anymore. Please go back to the deep forest. Please stay hidden. In the morning, the food was gone, and in the crate was the cedar bark basket they'd given me in January, carefully placed, empty. They understood. Somehow they understood that something had changed, that the arrangement was over. I saw them one more time, 3 days later, at dawn. They were at the tree line, just visible through the morning mist, mother, juvenile, and for the first time clearly visible, the male, massive and protective. They stood there for perhaps a minute, looking toward my cabin. The juvenile raised one hand, palm forward, fingers spread, the gesture I'd taught it. Goodbye. Then they turned and walked back into the forest, and I never saw them again. The equipment came down a week later. The exclusion zone was quietly established. My feeding citation was reduced to a warning, and life returned to something resembling normal, except nothing was normal anymore. I'd touched mystery. I'd been trusted by beings that had every reason to fear my species, and in trying to help them, I'd put them at risk. The forest kept its silence, and I kept mine. But sometimes, late at night, I hear wood knocks in the distance, 3 sharp raps, the same rhythm that started it all, and I wonder if they're still out there, surviving, teaching their child to avoid the species that feeds but also betrays. I wonder if they forgive me. The federal presence didn't leave. It just became invisible. Dr. Chen visited my cabin twice a week, ostensibly to debrief but really to monitor whether I was maintaining the feeding cessation. She was thorough, professional, and somewhere beneath the bureaucratic surface, genuinely concerned about the family's welfare. They've moved deeper into the exclusion zone, she told me during one visit in early April. Thermal signatures show they're avoiding the boundary areas entirely now. That's good. It means the deterrent strategy is working. Deterrent strategy, I repeated. You mean the sound cannons and motion sensors that make them uncomfortable in their own territory. Their territory is 40 square miles of protected wilderness. We've created uncomfortable zones in less than 2% of that space, just enough to establish that human proximity equals negative stimuli. It's classical conditioning, and it's working. I didn't argue. I'd agreed to this, but agreeing and accepting were different things. What Dr. Chen didn't tell me, what I found out later through Ranger Webb, who'd become something of an reluctant ally, was that the operation was much larger than I'd understood. The federal government hadn't just closed my section of forest. They'd been tracking multiple family groups across the entire Olympic range for almost 30 years. There are at least 4 breeding populations, Webb told me over coffee at his ranger station. Maybe 60 individuals total, scattered across terrain so rugged that complete mapping is impossible. Your family group is one of the best documented because of your intervention. Is that what we're calling it? He smiled grimly. Better than unauthorized interspecies contact, which is what the paperwork says. Tom, you need to understand something. The people running this operation, they're not the bad guys. They've spent decades keeping these beings safe from exactly the kind of attention that would destroy them. One verified photograph on the internet, one body in a lab, and it's over. Every cryptozoologist, every hunter, every government agency with an agenda descends on these mountains. So we protect them by lying about their existence. We protect them by respecting their right to remain undiscovered. There's a difference. I thought about that. About the ethics of secrecy when the secret involved intelligent beings living alongside us, unknown and unprotected by any law except the ones enforced through classification and denial. What about their rights? I asked. If they're intelligent, if they have language and culture and families, don't they deserve recognition? Legal protection that doesn't depend on people like you and me keeping quiet? Webb was quiet for a long time. You think recognition equals protection? Look what legal acknowledgement did for indigenous peoples. Centuries of treaties broken, land stolen, culture destroyed, all perfectly legal. These beings have something more valuable than rights. They have invisibility, and invisibility is the only reason they've survived this long. He had a point, but it still felt like cowardice, disguised as protection. The dilemma deepened in mid-April, when Dr. Chen brought troubling news. One of the family group, she wouldn't specify which one, but I could guess from the size parameters she described, had been observed with a visible injury, limping significantly, favoring one side, showing signs of infection. Could be a fall, could be a failed hunt, could be anything, she said. But it's progressing badly. If it's who we think it is, the family unit's survival could be compromised. The mother, It had to be the mother. The injury I'd noticed in her gait near the end of our feeding arrangement, the one I'd been compensating for with higher protein foods. "Let me help," I said immediately. "Absolutely not. No contact means no contact. You just said their survival is compromised. I'm a wildlife rehabilitator. I can prepare medical supplies, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, wound care materials. Leave them the same way I left food. It's not that simple. Administering medication requires dosage calculation based on body mass we can only estimate. Wrong dosage could be fatal, and approaching an injured, potentially desperate individual of this size and intelligence is incredibly dangerous. More dangerous than letting her die and leaving a juvenile and breeding male without." I stopped, realizing what I'd just revealed. Dr. Chen studied me carefully. "You really did bond with them, didn't you? This isn't just scientific curiosity. This is personal. They trusted me. I taught them to trust humans. Then I cut them off when it became inconvenient for federal management. If she dies because I'm not allowed to help, that blood is on all of us." She pulled out her tablet, pulled up thermal footage from the previous night. The images were clearer than anything I'd seen before. Government equipment, military-grade sensors. The footage showed 3 heat signatures in a bedding area. The largest one, the male, was positioned protectively. The middle signature, definitely the mother, showed irregular heat distribution suggesting fever or infection, and the small one, the juvenile, pressed close to the mother's side. "If we intervene," Dr. Chen said quietly, "we set a precedent. Every future illness, every injury, becomes an ethical crisis. Do we help or do we let nature take its course? At what point does protection become interference? At the point where our actions cause the vulnerability in the first place," I said. I made her comfortable enough with human proximity that she let her guard down. If that's what led to the injury, if she was in territory she wouldn't normally risk because she'd learned humans weren't threats, then we have a moral obligation to correct our mistake. Dr. Chen closed the tablet. "I'll take it to Dr. Reed. But Tom, even if he approves a medical intervention, it won't be you making the delivery. It'll be specialists with tranquilizers and protocols. It'll be capture, treatment, and release. Is that what you want for them?" The thought of the mother being darted, handled, processed like an animal in a zoo, it turned my stomach. But the alternative was watching her decline through thermal cameras while doing nothing. "What I want," I said carefully, "is for her to have the same choice any intelligent being deserves. Informed consent. But since we can't give her that, we make the choice that prioritizes her life over our ethical comfort." Dr. Chen stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "For what it's worth, I think you did something remarkable. You proved they could trust us. The tragedy isn't that you fed them. It's that the world isn't ready for beings that challenge everything we think we know about intelligence and personhood." After she left, I sat alone in my cabin, looking at the carved stick on my mantel, the gift they'd given me, proof of artistic expression and symbolic thought, and I wondered if Webb was right, if invisibility was the best protection we could offer, or if we were just calling cowardice by a more comfortable name. Dr. Reed approved the medical intervention, but with conditions so restrictive they bordered on mockery. A team of wildlife veterinarians would prepare a supply cache, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, wound care supplies, to be left in a location the family group was known to frequent. No direct contact, no observation, just resources left like an offering to gods we weren't allowed to acknowledge. "It's a compromise," Dr. Chen explained. "We provide aid without imposing presence. If they take it, they take it. If they don't, we respect that choice. They don't know what antibiotics are. They don't know dosage or application. You're leaving medical supplies for beings with intelligence but not medical training and calling it help. Do you have a better option that doesn't involve tranquilizing a potentially dying individual who might have family members willing to defend her violently?" I didn't. That was the problem. The supply cache was placed on April 22nd, in a location thermal cameras had shown consistent family activity. The supplies were packed in a waterproof container with visual instructions, simple pictograms showing administration, dosage intervals marked in symbols rather than written language. It felt absurd and desperate in equal measure. For 3 days, the container sat untouched. Thermal monitoring showed the family group in the area, but avoiding the specific location. They knew something had been left. They were suspicious. On the 4th day, the male approached it. The thermal footage that Dr. Chen showed me was extraordinary. He circled the container multiple times, examining it from every angle. He touched it carefully, testing weight and stability. Then he opened it, the simple latch presenting no obstacle to those intelligent hands, and examined the contents. He didn't take anything. He studied it, then closed the container and withdrew. He's assessing risk, Dr. Chen said, trying to determine if this is bait or trap. Smart. That night the mother approached. Her gait was noticeably impaired even on thermal, favoring her right side significantly. She opened the container, removed items one at a time, examining each one. The antibiotics, packaged in pre-measured doses with pictogram instructions, held her attention longest. Then she did something that made my breath catch. She looked up directly at where we knew a thermal camera was positioned. Not random scanning, direct eye contact with the lens, as if she knew she was being watched and wanted us to know she knew. She took the antibiotics. She took the wound dressing materials. She left everything else. She understands, I whispered. She knows those specific items are medical supplies, or she recognizes them from observation of human behavior, Dr. Ori. Chen countered. Pattern recognition doesn't necessarily equal comprehension of germ theory and pharmaceutical intervention. But over the next week, the thermal signatures told a different story. The mother's gait improved. The heat distribution suggesting fever normalized. She was applying the medicine and it was working. On April 30th, something appeared in the empty medical supply container. Fresh yarrow, Oregon grapefruit, and what I identified as ghost pipe. All medicinal plants, all harvested expertly. And underneath them, a small carved figure made from cedar wood. It was a human, crude but unmistakable, a standing figure, arms at its sides, no facial features but clearly representational. It was maybe 4 inches tall, smoothed and shaped with obvious care. Trade, Dr. Chen said. Or payment. She's reciprocating. She's communicating, I corrected. This isn't just, here are some plants, this is, I understand you are human, and I am acknowledging your humanity by representing it. The implications were staggering. Representational art, symbolic thought, the understanding that other beings have form and identity distinct from one's own. These weren't just markers of intelligence. They were markers of theory of mind, of consciousness that recognizes other consciousnesses. Dr. Chen let me keep the carving. Off the record, she said. Because officially nothing was exchanged here except medical supplies that coincidentally disappeared. I placed it on my mantle next to the stick, 2 pieces of art created by beings that supposedly didn't exist, that had no legal standing, no rights, no recognition beyond classified federal files. The ethical weight became unbearable. I contacted Dr. Reed directly. They're creating art. They're using medicine. They're demonstrating reciprocity and symbolic communication. At what point do we acknowledge that we're not protecting wildlife? We're protecting people? Dr. Reed's response was surprisingly sympathetic. You're not wrong, Mr. Whitmore, but legally and politically you're asking for something that would require rewriting fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness, legal personhood, and property rights, the moment we acknowledge sapient non-humans exist on U.S. soil. Every framework we've built about who has rights and who doesn't falls apart. Good. Maybe it should fall apart. Maybe. But in the meantime, while lawyers and philosophers debate personhood, these beings need protection in the here and now, and the only protection we can currently offer is secrecy in space. It's not ideal. It's barely adequate, but it's what we have. He sent me a file after that conversation, heavily redacted, classified above my clearance, but shared anyway. It was a population viability analysis for the Olympic family groups. The conclusion was stark. With current population estimates between 50-80 individuals, assuming slow reproduction rates and high juvenile mortality, the species was functionally extinct. One major habitat disruption, one disease outbreak, one systematic hunting campaign, and they would disappear entirely. We're not protecting a population, Dr. Reed's note attached to the file read. We're witnessing an extinction in slow motion. The only question is whether they disappear in peace and dignity, or whether their last years become a circus of exploitation and study. I understood his position. I even agreed with parts of it. But sitting in my cabin looking at the carved human figure that represented me, that said, I see you and I understand what you are, I couldn't shake the feeling that secrecy was just another form of erasure. They existed. They thought and felt and created and loved. and we were choosing to pretend they didn't because acknowledging them was too complicated, too expensive, too disruptive to systems we'd built on the assumption that we were alone in our intelligence. The mother recovered fully by mid-May. The thermal footage showed her returning to normal activity patterns, the family group resuming their routine. They'd survived the winter. They'd survived the injury. They'd survived our help. But I wondered, for how long? And at what cost? The secret lasted exactly 6 weeks after my feeding cessation. On May 15th, a hiker named Jeremy Paulson captured 17 seconds of footage on his cell phone. He'd been backcountry camping in an area adjacent to the exclusion zone. Legal, permitted, but close enough to matter. The footage showed a figure moving through dense undergrowth approximately 100 yards away. Bipedal, massive, covered in dark hair, moving with purpose before disappearing into the tree line. The video quality was poor, shaky, distant, through vegetation, but it was clear enough. More importantly, the metadata embedded in the file showed exact GPS coordinates and timestamp. It could be verified, authenticated, analyzed. Paulson posted it to YouTube at 11:47 a.m. By 3 p.m., it had 200,000 views. By midnight, over 2 million. By morning, it was on every major news network, dissected by experts and skeptics, transformed from 17 seconds of ambiguous footage into definitive proof or obvious hoax, depending on who was analyzing it. The comment I'd been dreading came from a wildlife biologist at Washington State University. If authentic, those coordinates place this sighting within 3 miles of recently designated federal exclusion zones. The timing of those closures, combined with this footage, suggests authorities may have prior knowledge of species presence in that region. The connection had been made. Publicly, Dr. Reed called me at 6 a.m. the day after the video went viral. Pack essentials. You're being relocated for your own safety. Relocated? As of this morning, we've logged over 300 inquiries to local ranger stations asking about access to areas near your property. News crews are en route to Kino. By noon, there will be helicopters over that forest, and by evening, there will be people with guns and cameras heading into terrain they're completely unprepared for. You're associated with that area. That makes you a target for interviews, exploitation, or worse. I'm not leaving. Mr. Whitmore, these are my mountains. That's my cabin. I've lived here for 37 years, and I'm not running because people finally noticed what I've known all along. Silence on the line. Then, you understand you'll be harassed? Media, researchers, cryptozoology enthusiasts, hunters hoping to bag a trophy. Your peaceful life is over. My peaceful life ended when I started feeding a family I knew I couldn't protect. I'm staying, but I want assurance that the exclusion zone will be enforced, that the family will be safe. We're tripling ranger patrols and setting up checkpoints at every access point. But that video came from legal public land. We can't stop people from being where they're legally allowed to be. We can only intercept them before they reach the exclusion boundary. The first news van arrived at 2 p.m., then another. By evening, there were 7 vehicles parked along the road leading to my property, cameras and reporters setting up for what they clearly hoped would be ongoing coverage. A young woman from a Portland news station approached my porch. Mr. Whitmore? Jessica Chang, Coin News. Can you comment on reports that you've had direct sightings of unidentified primates in this area? No comment. Residents in Kinol say you've been purchasing unusual amounts of bulk food supplies. Can you confirm whether you've been conducting feeding operations? I feed deer and injured wildlife. That's what wildlife rehabilitators do. Now please leave my property. She persisted. They all persisted. For 3 days, my cabin was effectively under siege. Not hostile, but constant, intrusive, exhausting. Every movement I made was documented. Every trip to my truck was intercepted with questions. On the 4th day, someone breached the exclusion zone. His name was Marcus Webb, no relation to the ranger, a hunter from Idaho with a YouTube channel dedicated to cryptid encounters. He'd hiked in through a remote access point, avoided the ranger checkpoints, and set up trail cameras throughout the family group's core territory. Federal rangers found him 12 hours later, hypothermic and disoriented, claiming he'd been chased by something large and aggressive. His equipment was confiscated, he was cited for multiple federal violations, and his footage was seized as evidence. But the damage was done. His YouTube channel, updated by someone managing it remotely, posted before and after photos of his location. The inference was clear. He'd found something, and the government had silenced him. The conspiracy theories exploded. Federal cover-up, hidden species, government protection of cryptid populations. Some of it was absurdly wrong. Some of it was accidentally accurate. All of it drove more attention, more curiosity, more danger toward beings that had survived specifically by avoiding this kind of attention. Dr. Chen visited me on May 22nd, looking exhausted. The family group has moved. We're tracking them through thermal, but they've gone deep, beyond our primary sensor grid, into terrain we haven't fully mapped. They're avoiding their usual territory entirely, because it's been invaded. Because the safe space I helped create is now surrounded by people trying to find them. You couldn't have known this would happen. I knew exactly what would happen. I just hoped I'd be dead before it did. She showed me footage, not from government sensors, but from confiscated civilian equipment. Dozens of trail cameras, thermal scopes, motion sensors, all illegally placed within the exclusion zone by people who'd managed to circumvent ranger patrols. The perimeter was failing. The protection was inadequate, and the family group was running out of places to hide. What's the plan? I asked. Emergency expansion of the exclusion zone. Federal enforcement with prosecution priority. Public education campaign emphasizing that these areas are closed for environmental protection, not cryptid preservation. Basically, we're trying to bore people into losing interest. That won't work. You've seen the footage metrics. This isn't going away. I know. We sat in silence. Two people complicit in a disaster neither of us had meant to cause, but both of us had enabled through good intentions and catastrophic execution. They created art, I said quietly. They showed intelligence, culture, medicine, symbolic thought, and our species responded by hunting them like monsters. What does that say about us? Dr. Chen stood to leave. It says we're not ready. Maybe we'll never be ready. But that doesn't change the fact that they're here. They're real, and they deserve better than what we're giving them. After she left, I looked at the carved human figure on my mantle, the mother's artistic representation of me, created in gratitude or communication or simple acknowledgement of shared existence. I'd fed them for 6 months. I'd helped them survive the winter. I'd been trusted by beings that had every reason to fear humanity. And in doing so, I'd destroyed the very thing I'd hoped to protect. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't with the family group. It was with myself. June brought relative calm. The news cycle moved on. The YouTube videos stopped trending. And the crowds of curiosity seekers dwindled to a few dedicated enthusiasts who came more for the camping than the cryptozoology. The exclusion zone enforcement held, mostly. Rangers turned back hikers, confiscated illegal equipment, prosecuted the most egregious violations, but the damage lingered. The family group hadn't returned to their core territory. Thermal tracking showed them in fragmented locations, never staying more than a few days in any one place, exhibiting stress behaviors that suggested constant vigilance and disrupted routines. The juvenile wasn't growing at expected rates. The mother was avoiding open areas entirely. The male was displaying increasingly aggressive territorial behaviors, marking trees excessively, vocalizing more frequently, acting like something under siege. They were suffering. Because of me. Dr. Chen stopped visiting in person, switching to satellite phone check-ins. We're documenting learned trauma response, she told me in early June. The family unit has fundamentally altered behavior patterns. They've been taught that their territory isn't safe, that human proximity is unpredictable, and that survival requires constant displacement. From a conservation perspective, this represents catastrophic disruption. Can it be reversed? Unknown. If we maintain absolute exclusion for several years, if they're allowed to re-establish patterns without interruption, possibly. But the psychological impact, we don't have baseline data for trauma recovery in this species. We're operating blind. I made a decision then that I'd been avoiding for weeks. I needed to see them one more time. Not to feed them, not to interfere, but to understand what I'd done, to witness the consequences of my compassion. I hiked into the deep forest on June 15th, beyond the exclusion boundary, into terrain I'd explored decades ago but hadn't visited in years. No GPS, no communication devices, no equipment that could be tracked or monitored. Just an old man walking into mountains that had been keeping secrets longer than governments had existed to classify them. I found their new bedding site on the 3rd day, a temporary structure in a steep ravine, built with less care than their previous locations, positioned for concealment rather than comfort. The tracks around it showed agitation, pacing patterns, false starts, constant repositioning. I didn't approach. I found a position downslope, behind a fallen cedar, and waited. They appeared at dusk, Mother and juvenile first, then the male arriving from a different direction, scouting perimeter before allowing the others to settle. The juvenile had grown, but not enough. The physical development I'd seen accelerating during our feeding arrangement had slowed, probably due to inadequate nutrition and constant stress. The mother looked exhausted, not physically injured but carrying a weight in her posture that spoke to something deeper than fatigue. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone expecting threat from any direction. I watched them through binoculars as they conducted evening routines, the juvenile attempting to play, the mother discouraging it with gentle corrections, the male maintaining watch. There was no foraging, no teaching, no moments of rest or curiosity, just survival at its most basic. And then the mother stopped, froze, mid-movement. Her head tilted slightly, testing the wind, reading the forest with senses far superior to mine. She'd detected me. The male immediately positioned himself between her and my direction. The juvenile pressed close to the mother's side. They waited. Absolute stillness, assessing threat level. I did the only thing that felt right. I stood up, slowly, making myself visible. I raised one hand, palm forward, fingers spread. The gesture the juvenile had learned months ago. Recognition was instantaneous. The mother's posture changed, not relaxed but less defensive. She saw me. She remembered me. And whatever she felt about that recognition was complex enough that she didn't immediately flee or signal aggression. We stood like that for perhaps 2 minutes. Too far apart for detailed features, but close enough for acknowledgement. I wasn't here to feed them. I wasn't here to study them. I was just here, bearing witness, accepting responsibility, offering the only thing I had left to give. Recognition that they existed, that they mattered, that what happened to them was not nothing. The mother made a sound. Low, modulated, brief. The juvenile responded with a higher-pitched vocalization. Then the male made a sound I'd never heard before. Deep, resonant, almost mournful. It echoed through the ravine for several seconds before fading into silence. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with the practiced silence of beings who'd been hiding for millennia. I stood there until full dark, understanding with absolute clarity what that encounter had meant. It wasn't forgiveness. I had no right to expect that. It wasn't gratitude. The trauma I'd caused outweighed any winter assistance I'd provided. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that we had shared something, however briefly, however imperfectly, that in a world where their species and mine had carefully avoided each other for thousands of years, we had tried something different, and it had failed. But the failure itself was significant. It proved that coexistence was possible, just not in the way I'd attempted it. Not through feeding and dependency, but through respect and distance. Through the understanding that some beings don't need our help, they need our absence. I hiked out the next morning. Didn't file a report with Dr. Chen about the encounter. Didn't mark the location or provide coordinates. Just returned to my cabin and resumed my life with the knowledge that some mistakes can't be corrected, only learned from. The carved human figures stayed on my mantle. The cedar bark basket stayed in my closet. Physical evidence of a relationship that had existed, however briefly, between species separated by everything except the capacity for compassion. And sometimes late at night I still hear wood knocks in the distance. 3 sharp raps fading into silence. I never knock back. Some conversations need to remain unfinished. Some relationships serve their purpose by ending. And some beings deserve to remain mysterious not because we can't understand them, but because understanding them requires letting them go. 5 years have passed since I last saw the family group. The federal exclusion zone remains in place, quietly maintained through bureaucratic language about ecosystem restoration and critical habitat protection. The media attention died within months, as it always does, chasing newer mysteries and fresher controversies. Dr. Chen retired in 2021. Before she left, she sent me a final file, comprehensive population surveys across the Olympic Range, conducted through passive monitoring with minimal intrusion. The data showed stable numbers, approximately 70 individuals in 6 family groups, maintaining traditional territories, exhibiting normal behaviors. The family I'd fed was listed among them. The juvenile, now classified as subadult based on thermal measurements, was showing appropriate development. The breeding pair remained bonded and active. They'd returned to their original territory 2 years after the public incident, once human traffic had returned to normal levels. They'd survived, not because of my help, But despite it, Martha Hendricks passed away in 2022. Before she died, she told me something I'd never known. She'd seen them too back in the 1970s, when she was young and the forest was even wilder. A family group crossing a creek, moving with such grace and intelligence that she'd known immediately they weren't animals in the conventional sense. "I never told anyone," she said. "Figured the forest was keeping them for a reason. Your mistake wasn't feeding them, Tom. Your mistake was thinking you could improve on millions of years of successful hiding." She was right, of course. The hubris of thinking my compassion was more valuable than their autonomy, that my help was needed or wanted, that I could somehow make their survival more secure by inserting myself into their world. It was human arrogance dressed up as kindness. But I learned something from the failure. I learned that the highest form of respect is sometimes absence. That love can mean leaving alone. That protection doesn't always require intervention. Sometimes it requires stepping back and trusting that beings who've survived this long probably know what they're doing. The carved human figure is still on my mantle. I look at it every morning, remembering what it represents. Not my compassion or their gratitude, but a moment when two species tried something different, when trust was extended and accepted, however briefly, when the gulf between human and non-human narrowed enough that we could see each other clearly. That moment mattered, even though it couldn't last. I'm 73 now. The cabin shows its age, and so do I. My rehabilitator's license is still active, but most of my work now involves advising younger people who have the energy for field work. I tell them about owls and elk and salmon. I don't tell them about the other things I've seen in these mountains. Some knowledge isn't meant to be passed on. Some stories serve their purpose by remaining untold. But I think about them often. The mother, the juvenile who's now grown, the male who stood watch while his family foraged. I wonder if they remember the winter when food appeared regularly, when survival was a little easier. I wonder if the now adult juvenile teaches their own offspring about that strange time when humans could be trusted, before they learned better. I wonder if they've forgiven us for the chaos that followed, or if forgiveness isn't relevant, if they simply adapted, as they've always adapted, and moved on. The forest has returned to its secrets. The trails I used to walk are overgrown. The clearing where I left food is indistinguishable from any other small opening in the canopy. Nature has a way of erasing evidence, of covering human mistakes with moss and time, but the evidence exists in other ways. In classified files that document population movements and behavioral patterns, in thermal footage stored on encrypted servers, in the knowledge carried by a handful of people who've dedicated careers to protecting beings that officially don't exist, and in the memories of an old man who learned too late that compassion without wisdom can be its own form of cruelty. I received one final communication from Dr. Chen before she retired, a letter, handwritten, marked personal, rather than official. She wrote, "You asked me once what gave us the right to decide these beings should remain hidden. I didn't have a good answer then. I'm not sure I do now, but I've come to believe that the question itself is backwards. It's not about our right to decide their visibility. It's about their right to decide their own level of human contact. And consistently, across decades of observation, they've chosen distance. They've chosen secrecy. They've chosen to remain unexplained. Maybe respecting that choice is the only right we actually have." She was correct. The beings in these forests have agency, intelligence, and millions of years of successful survival strategy. Who are we to decide that visibility would serve them better than mystery? Who are we to determine that recognition is more valuable than autonomy? The answer is, we're not. We're just the species that can't resist intervening, can't accept that some problems don't need solving, some beings don't need saving, and some mysteries serve everyone better by remaining mysterious. I still hear the wood knocks sometimes, those 3 sharp raps that echo through the valley on quiet nights. I don't know if it's them. I don't know if they're communicating with each other or marking territory or doing something humans don't have concepts for yet. And that's exactly how it should be. Because the real lesson of those 6 months isn't about Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever name we assign to beings that have their own names for themselves. The real lesson is about humility. The recognition that we don't need to understand everything, don't need to help everything, don't need to insert ourselves into every story. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is to step back, close our mouths, and let the forest keep its secrets.